Thank you for coming on a Monday night, Sunday. It seems like a very peculiar day for a lecture. On the summer.
We'll do it anyway.
We'll do it anyway. It's my pleasure to introduce Emmanuel Petit. I think also it's very proper that we do in this lecture in the library, since the core of the lecture is the body of work that he's done through his book, and that hopefully most of you, or all of you, should buy. Basically to disagree with all the content that is in. But no, it's, I think Emmanuel lecture is going to be a very interesting contribution to the discussion that I think is going on today and tomorrow and around the summer, particularly on the students and working on thesis. And I think it's very current, the issues that he touched in the book, and my hope of what the lecture is going to be. And I think the body of work that Emmanuel has been invested in the last 3 or 4 years, probably. I mean, it has been longer, but for sure materialized in the last 3 or 4 years, at least, that I'm aware. Emmanuel has been teaching in Yale, the School of Architecture, and also he writes, curates, publish many articles, and so on. He is, without doubt, one of the strongest voices in the field right now. But what really interests me about the context of this conversation is, I think, it's at the core of an interesting crossroad and debate that we are immersed in the middle of it. They have to do with a certain saturation of a trajectory that take us to look back and revisit some sort of recent other trajectories, and the conflict that introduced about how you move forward. I mean, when you look back and you reanalyze, and in this case, as the title of the lecture and the book make clear, how he revisits some of the issues that was established by the postmodernism, and what are the consequences of that today, and how that position creates a position and how it changed the relation, how we try to elaborate how to move forward. And this, I have to say, is an incredibly difficult proposition, and I'm not so sure that one lecture and probably one period of a semester of thesis is enough to solve it, but certainly I would say it's at the core of the problem that we are faced with it. In any kind of moment of crisis, whatever is that, the context of that, I would argue a disciplinary discourse crisis that want to be presented by certain people. I don't think that that's particularly the case, but there is a certain emergent feeling in relation to that. They usually produce two kinds of reaction. One is we go back to what we know, and we became incredibly retrograde and conservative of the worst kind. The other one is we look back and we look in the past, and we try to analyze what was not covered there, that it can be rediscovered so we can move forward. But I would argue that both of them has a very strong sense of an ideological political debate, which in a strange way, I think he has found a way to make back in relation to the problem of techniques and methodology. And that seems, at least from our part, like a crucial discussion to have. So I'm interested to see what Emmanuel lecture can contribute to that, and what kind of polemic and discussion we can have. He is a polemic guy. He's a guy who doesn't take great positions about it. I think he's wrong more often than right. But even when he's that, he does it with passion and commitment to it. So it's my pleasure to introduce Emmanuel Petit. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Hanan. It's a great introduction to be told that one is more often wrong than right, but I'll take it. I love it. Thanks also for inviting me to give a talk here, also to Eric for having me at SciArc. I love to come here. I like LA quite a bit because it's rougher than the East Coast, and from time to time that's good to see. But also because SciArc is a very experimental place, and those kinds of institutions don't exist that often in the world. I just came back from the Architectural Association in London. I think that might be another one of those places that are very interested in experimental thought. But there are not too many of those institutions, and I think you should absolutely cultivate that culture and also develop it. It's also good to see so many known faces, some of which freak me out. The fact that Jeff is sitting in the back freaks me out. I hope he won't be allowed to be given the mic to ask a question, but he might. Hernan asked me to talk about my book, which is here. It was published this spring, so it's fresh off the press. The title of the book is Irony or the Self-Critical Opacity of Postmodern Architecture. It might be a cryptic title. That's certainly something that the publisher told me, that this is too long, nobody will understand what it means, and what does it mean in the first place, and all that. Just to give you a quick hint, just a fast one, opacity I want to see in contrast to the notion of transparency that was so central to most of modernity. And I think when transparency turns into opacity, that's an interesting moment when form becomes visible rather than what form is referring to. So the title may be cryptic, but I hoped that it would allude to other titles that played a big role in our discipline and that you know of, one of which is Koolhaas's Exodus, or the voluntary prisoners of architecture. And the other one is Frederick Jameson's book, Postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, which I think is a great book about postmodernism, and a book that I don't agree with. I mean, clearly, to say that postmodernism is about pastiched form is something that I don't find interesting as an architect. And part of the mission of my book was to explain why postmodernism is not as shallow and not about pastiche like Jameson says it is. My book exists to read, so I'm not going to rehearse the book today, but I want to set what I say in the book in context with an interest that I have now. So what I'm going to do is give a brief presentation of my current interest or my current research, then make a flashback to the argument in the book, and that will be the longest part, and then finish with a quick reflection about the contemporary situation in architecture and what I think we are neglecting in our discussions or should be careful about. Now, in general, my interest, if in the most general version, lies with arguments about human ontology and how those arguments impinge on architectural form and theories of the contemporary city. Now, human ontology is the question about being. Who are we? What constitutes the core of what we are? So evidently, philosophy plays a big role for me. It just does. It's not something I really can choose. I have an interest in it. Cultural theory to a point, and evidently the discipline of architecture, really the discipline with its theories, its history, its protagonists, its rituals, its jargons, its texts, its objects, and so on. I think that those contexts, these philosophy, cultural theory, and the discipline of architecture help me at least situate architecture as a part of the humanities. And I think that's where it belongs, that's where it is strongest, that's where it is most interesting in. Now, fundamentally, new arguments about human ontology are very rare, and therefore, when they appear, one has to be really attentive to them, I think. And radical changes in architecture and in our understanding of the city never happen without those new understandings of human ontology. And we can learn from history. I don't think that the idea of the ideal city would have been thinkable, and I think thinkable is the right word. We would not have been able to think it without Italian humanism and its understanding of human ontology. The phalanstary towns would not have been thinkable without social utopianism. The cité industrielle without scientific positivism. The German Großstadt without social democracy. The American metropolis without pragmatist philosophy, and so on. In other words, architectural form which shows up unescorted by a new consciousness about human existence is not thinkable in my mind. We cannot think those forms. We all know well the arguments that have been presented about tectonics in architecture. I'm talking about the Böttichers of this world, the Böttichers, Viollet-le-Duc, Gottfried Sempers, those people. For me, the more relevant or interesting tectonic joint or connection in architecture is not between a beam and a column or a wall and a ceiling and what have you, just read Semper, but between things on the one hand and ideas on the other, between physics and metaphysics. That's the real tectonic joint in architecture that I find most relevant. And because this idea was so central for me, I put this cartoon on the cover page of my book. It's a cartoon by Saul Steinberg, who you know as a prominent cartoonist of the New Yorker magazine, but what I find interesting is that he was trained as an architect in Milan, and that, because he thinks like an architect, I think, it makes his cartoons really relevant to the architectural context. And this is A Cube's Dream, which expresses something like a cube is only a cube when it is conceptualized, meaning when it lives this double life as a phenomenon. On the one hand, you see it casts a shadow, so it must be a phenomenon, and a concept on the other hand, where its mathematical constitution becomes visible. And the dream bubble is kind of the tectonic link that between those two worlds, the physical and the metaphysical world, a link that we want to be stable and also durable. That's why I call it a tectonic link. Now, let me dive right into a very brief description of a current interest I have. I was very fascinated when I came across German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk's claim in his Spheres trilogy books that life is a question of form. He says that right in the introduction. I thought that this is a very good starting point for a philosophical argument to become relevant for architects. Life is a question of form. What Sloterdijk discusses on the 2,000 pages of his 3 books is in fact quite simple and is illustrated with a discussion of form and space. Now, what is he saying? When philosophers ask the question, who are we? Simple philosophical question, very primordial question, who are we? They make it conventionally into a solipsistic story. It's all about the individual, as if the human being existed ever alone and in isolation. Just take an example that all of you know, but you could take basically any philosopher before Sloterdijk, that's the argument. Take Descartes. René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. It's all about the I, me, myself. The context of others is not really part of this kind of equation. I think, therefore I am. Now, Sloterdijk thinks differently about this question. Humans never exist. By the way, this is this very simple relationship between the subject who thinks, the object, and if you take it in modern psychoanalysis, the object can be an it or an other, meaning it can be a thing or another person, but basically it's the same question about the subject being conceptualized in solitude, all alone, and the subject thinking the object that stands apart from the subject. Now, Sloterdijk thinks about this question very differently, and it has spatial consequences. That's why I'm interested in it. For Sloterdijk, this diagram is more complicated. The subject doesn't stand alone, but there are other notions. The object, which is the crap that you need to get rid of in order to conserve life. You go to the toilet in order to get rid of all the stuff that would kill you if it stayed with you in your sphere. That's the object. And this is a scene from Cronenbergs Videodrome, where, of course, this idea of the object is kind of central. And then there are the nobjects, which is, of course, a contraction of non-objects. The nobjects are those conditions that surround us, that are so close to us that we don't even see that they are constitutive of what we are. And the example that he gives is the umbilical cord when we are a fetus in the womb. The umbilical cord is not something that you can get at a distance from, to say, oh, an object, how interesting, it is something other than me, and then you can critically conceptualize it. The umbilical cord is so close to you, it sticks to you, it is so intimate to you that it is constitutive of your space, your sphere, and Sloterdijk calls this an object. So in Sloterdijk, the spaces that he's interested in is that from birth on, when you are a fetus in the womb, you are never alone, but you are already in a space of communication with an other, which in this case is, of course, the mother. You are in dialogue. You are part of a sphere of communication with the mother. When in his second book, he basically goes to the next level of, he goes scalarly up from the micro scale to a very big scale. He goes to the scale of the discovery of other continents, the maritime discovery of the globe, meaning the next sphere is the sphere of the globe, where we discover we are not alone on the globe, but the globe is inhabited by other people. So it's the kind of the beginning of globalization that Sloterdijk discusses in this book, and it is the realization that other people exist that we have to negotiate with. Commercial, this is maritime commercialism, but it also negotiate our ideas with. We inhabit a sphere with other people, not with the mother this time, but with other people. And the third volume discusses the contemporary city, where he conceptualizes the city as a sort of foam, where every adjacency can be seen as a bubble that shares a wall that separates it from the next bubble. And Sloterdijk says that in the contemporary city we exist in co-isolation, meaning we are isolated from the other people, but we share a wall. In the foam, one shares a wall with the next bubble. We share a wall, and that wall makes us understand how we are in relation to the next person who we are in fact separated from. So we exist in co-isolation. Now, that is Sloterdijk, and if you now look at some intradisciplinary theories, meaning in architecture, about the current city, and I chose an image that you have all seen a zillion times so that I don't need to explain its context, OMA of course, you can see the idea of individual bubbles sitting side by side, and those bubbles can be defined formally, but also programmatically, socially, or otherwise. That this idea of the sheer side-by-sidedness of bubbles is very much an active cultural concept also inside the discussion of architecture, that here these buildings, this city is a city of co-isolation, and the word that Sloterdijk uses is Individualgesellschaft, for the society of individuals, which is, in his mind, the kind of society that we live in. Very different, by the way, from the city of the captive globe, which is much more to do with corporate pragmatism, where at least this minimal common space of the grid that allows for circulation is still kind of a common, a shared thing, just like the currency, just like the dollar. Sheer circulation of the currency makes that city of the captive globe possible. Here, we don't even have the grid anymore as a shared space, but only co-isolated bubbles. Now, Sloterdijk derives the idea of individual, co-isolated spheres of existence from a sketch by none other than Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger, if you know a little bit of Heidegger, he hasn't drawn that much. So to find a sketch by him is pretty rare. And here it is. This is supposed to be a sketch of the spaces of human existence. And what you see is 5 arrows, 5 vectors of existence, 5 individual existences, each of which rushing towards a single semicircular horizon. So each of these existences constitutes an interior space, a space particular to that existence. Now, to make a very long story very short, contemporary architecture in the last decade and a half, I would say, has certainly reactivated the interest in the notion of the interior, in interiority, that bubbles exist with their own interior that sit next to one another. Now, this turn to interiority has different aspects or different dimensions. The first one I want to point out is the turn to atmosphere, to centrally immersive environments, what Sloterdijk would have called spaces of intimacy, of nearness, of extreme nearness, so that you don't even get to the conventional critical distance anymore, where you can say, architecture, I am the subject, this is architecture, here's my critical take on it. We don't get that critical distance because we are immersed in these environments, and of course that's one of the points that Sloterdijk makes. These are examples. I could have chosen other ones, you know these well, but they are examples of these spaces that are more addressed to the senses than to the intellect. Here's the Architects of Air, where you see that the intellect doesn't have much place here. It is mostly about this immersion into a sensual and even hedonistic space. And the notion of an embodied subjectivity is important here. The subject starts to feel rather than to think the spaces. And you can certainly say that spaces like these were directed against the glacial approach, just cold approach of post-structuralist theories that dominated the discussion or the discourse of architecture in the 1980s and early 1990s, where the subject was never really out of blood and flesh, but was a constructed text, a text. That is certainly not true in these kinds of spaces that focus on interiority. The second dimension, the second of this turn towards interiority, is devising forms and spaces of involution, spaces that turn inward, spaces that attempt to create a sense of infinity and an infinite universe on an inside of a building, rather than opening towards the outside, towards the city, which the labyrinthian spaces of postmodernism, of post-structuralism were, I would say, always interested in. This, of course, is, I did my homework. I knew I was coming to SCIARC, so you get this building. But you also get one that is very similar with subtle differences, but this idea of, here in Foster's City Hall in London case, is all about formulating a dynamic interior that gives you the sense of involution and of the infinite interior. Fuchs's example in Frankfurt, it's an example that I showed at the Princeton conference. Jeff was there last semester, and when I was done, Greg Lynn came to me and said, I showed this to my students and I said this is the worst space in the world, and I was presenting it as really a space that does something completely different from all the spaces that I have seen before. And I must say, in Frankfurt, I just stumbled into this space. I didn't really know what it was, who it was by, that it was there. And I thought that the ways in which you can kind of get lost by losing orientation on the inside of this space makes it really different from anything that I had seen before. Another one of those spaces is UN Studios Stuttgart Museum, where this infinite sense of looping around interior, here at least 3, if not 4 interiors, is very much a similar idea of this inward local form. If one had to kind of do an archaeology of precedents for this, I think one could bring up Friedrich Kiesler's Endless House. Kiesler, who tried to come up with an integrative object where you see in his diagram, here he writes existing facts, and you can see that the existing facts in each moment in time are multiple, are like multiple spheres, like atoms that have not much connection with one another. And what the architect is supposed to do is, and that's his theory of correlation, is define new interactions between all these autonomous facts and reintegrate them in a new object, a new piece of architecture that then is totally integrative, totally synthetic in that sense. And so that would be one precedent. Another one would be Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum, that was so hated by people like Vincent Scully, for the reason that it was an inward-looking building, that it kind of negated the grid of the city, that it is the only building of New York that kind of doesn't care about the orthogonal grid of the street grid. And another one might be, another precedent might be one of Frank Lloyd Wright's students, Bruce Gough's Garvey House, a building that is not often brought up, and also a person who is not often brought into the discussion of architecture, and I start to realize why. It's just, he didn't talk much. That makes sense anyways. And another aspect of this attention to the notion of interior, the third aspect that I want to bring up after atmosphere and spaces of involution, concerns the urban scale. The contemporary city is no longer thought of as either expansive or continuous, based on, if you take the modern paradigm of the urban paradigm, the grid, no longer based on that, or if you want the postmodern one, the texture, no longer that, both expansive paradigms. But the city is now based on this idea of, as you can see in the Dubai shoreline, of the side-by-sidedness of self-contained figures that are worlds in themselves. And at least in the case of this one, the neighborhood or the bubble, the urban bubble, is even called the world. So these are worlds in and of themselves that sit side by side without the need to have in between them any negotiative tissue. Like if you take Collage City, it would have been the poché between these ideological islands that would have created a kind of gradient between one ideology and another one. But in this example, you don't have that anymore, this in-between tissue, but it's only a side-by-sidedness. If you go from the horizontal look on this, onto the city to the vertical skyline view of the city, you have something very similar going on here in the case of Shanghai. You see stacked iconic volumes. Of course, I picked the example also because there are literally spheres in the skyline. But it's not only dependent on the figure of the sphere, but the spherical form is particularly clear in showing that one form sits on top of another form without much negotiation in between them. So maybe an expression of this foam model that Sloterdijk conceptualizes in his book. And one more aspect of this turn towards interiority has to do with the design process. The trust in the self-sufficiency of computational codes, algorithms, as kind of interior worlds in and of themselves, meaning the code is going to give you a whole world. And context doesn't really matter, because the code can grow from an inside towards an outside. So the code can be a computational code, as it is in this case, as you know, or the code can be just a collection of data, big data, or a collection of facts, another type of code that can be packed in just an otherwise very loose envelope. So those are different aspects of this turn towards interiority that I think is theorized in Sloterdijk and that we can identify in very different moments of contemporary architecture, as I hope you could see from these examples. Now, I want to kind of summarize this turn towards the involuted object with an image that Sloterdijk discusses himself in his Spheres trilogy, which is one of Hieronymus Bosch's strawberries from the Garden of Earthly Delights, as this kind of symbol of a convivial space. Remember that we started with the idea that the human being is no longer functioning as this autonomous thinker all alone, but is now inserted into a convivial space where hedonism is possible in a new way, conviviality, atmospheric togetherness, sphericalness plays a big role. The form is acontextual, sensual, interiorized, etc. And that as an urban paradigm, also as an architectural paradigm, is very distinct from these paradigms throughout the 20th century that all, I would claim, would be a thesis, have something to do with expansive space. If you take the grid of Le Corbusier, it's expansive. If you take the texture of the postmodern labyrinthian city, it is expansive and not involuted at all. Now, I'm contrasting this current space conception with the one that I discuss in my irony book, that are all spaces that are more labyrinthian, not hedonistic, but existentialist in character, as I will show, not synthetic, but dialectic, as I will show. So this I want to use as a kind of transition to this part of the talk where I want to talk about the thematic of the book. And here, too, I want to start with a brief discussion of space as conceptualized by two philosophers from two very different historical times, but both of whom are part of the philosophical tradition of existentialism, who are interested in the paradoxes of existence. I find that highly relevant, especially in the context of postmodernism. And so these two philosophical contexts are different from one another, but these philosophers use similar spatial syntaxes to talk about their philosophy, and that's what interests me. The first one of these philosophers is the pre-Socratic philosopher Zeno of Elea, who Aristotle called the inventor of the dialectic, the one versus the other. Right? Zeno described a whole series of paradoxes, and just to give you a sense of how he tried to demonstrate these paradoxes ad absurdum, I just show you one with just an image that I pulled off Google, so it's not, which is the dichotomy paradox or the racecourse paradox. Now, what is being stated in this paradox? Zeno's question is, how do we think moving from a point A to a point B? How do we think that problem? And of course, at his time, what was available to him to conceptualize the movement from one point to another point was the thesis of logics that were available to him. Now, what did those theses tell him? Well, you have to divide the interval between point A to point B into two equal segments so that the problem becomes reduced. But now you are faced with the same problem again twice. You have to go from a point A to a point B, although that distance has become smaller. The paradox of bridging the gap has just repeated itself. So in a way, to move from point A to point B at Zeno's time was unthinkable. It was an unthinkable paradox. And it was not solved mathematically until 2,200 years later by Leonhard Euler's infinitesimal calculus. That to think such a simple spatial thing, to go from point A to point B, is not thinkable at Zeno's time. Now, Zeno is mostly portrayed in connection with double doors. You see him here with double doors, in this case, the doors of truth and falsity, and he's leading and seducing the youth of Athens towards this spatial paradox, towards this dialectic between truth, the door of truth, and the door of falsity. Now, this is kind of one representation of the space of dialectic and paradox, and undecidability. How do you decide which door to enter through? And you can see how this could already be pertinent to post-structuralist theory. Now, the bottom line of this philosophy, the reason I bring it up is that thinking, in Zeno's case, doesn't yield synthetic answers, doesn't yield closure. He just describes problems that cannot be resolved, that just give you more problems, more dialectical paradoxes, that never give you a synthetic answer. Now, the two-ness of the space of paradox as described by Zeno is something that I want you to be aware of. In architecture, the play with the double element was very important in postmodernism with, for example, the typology of the double house, and there are many of those in postmodernism. It was kind of the petri dish. The double house was the petri dish for postmodern space. Let me give you examples, some that you know very well. This is one of Eisenmans' double houses, house 6, as you know. It's in fact, I mean, what's the idea behind this house? You design one house, One house just gives you no space, right? It's just a thing. But if you want to have a space appear, you have to double it up, because then you have non-identity. Then you have a kind of conflict between a first thing that has been said and its double. Then you take that double, you turn it upside down, and you nest it within the first cube. And what you get is, of course, a paradox where you don't know if the real house, the origin, the beginning, is the green, is associated with the green stair or the red stair, etc. So this idea of non-identity, this eternal dialectic between the first cube in the process and then the second one, where you double up the first cube. The first cube is the stem cell of architecture. It's nothing. It has no characteristics. That's why he chooses it. But when you double the same, you cannot import anything from the outside, because that would be kind of a corruption of the purity of the autonomous system. But if you double what you already have, then you get a dialectic system, a dialogue between two cubes that give you space. Now, another one of those double houses is one by Ungers. Again, you know it well. It's a double house conceived like architecture in Lacan's mirror stage, right? So you have one building that views itself in the mirror of a historical city, a wall that no longer exists, so the ghost of a city line, and that ghost of the past gives you the second cube, and you get this double house, which is kind of a play on the original, the reflection, across the memory line that no longer exists, the historic line of the city that has disappeared. Another one of those double houses, another one of those petri dish experiments of postmodern space, of the paradoxes of postmodern space, is Heidegger's House of the Convert, or the Undecided. And you know that with Heidegger you always get this narrative story. This double house, in fact it's two half houses, but it's a double half house, connected by a bridge, and inhabited by a guy who can't decide which part of the house to live in. So you get a kind of this conundrum, this psychoanalytical conundrum of not knowing which part of the space to belong to. And so this paradox is something that is very visible here with Heidegger too. Another example is Stanley Tigerman. And by the way, I'm showing you these examples to show you that in postmodernism, it wasn't style that really was the kind of connective tissue between ideas that, after all, were very similar to one another. That's what I'm trying to show. That if you want to understand postmodernism, forget the style debate, because it won't get you very far. Because you would have to maybe exclude Eisenmans from the discussion, which he would like to do, but I don't see why you would do it, because it's so similar to what all these other guys did. Or Raymond Abraham, to come to this context, who would have hated to be part of a lecture on postmodernism and be part of it. But for me, it's not so different, and I'm going to show you in a while an example by him. So this is Stanley Tigerman, again, a double house. One half of the house is, the volume of the house consists of trees, so nature. The other house is built, the other half of the house is built. So you get this paradox between, or this paradoxical relationship, this dialogue between architecture and nature, the naturalness of architecture, the architecturalness of nature, the paradox that you cannot resolve in a synthetic form, but you have to keep the paradox going. Here's Raymond Abraham, a very similar play on nature. He finds a mound. The mound, finding a mound in nature gives you just nature, no architecture, just nature. But once you scratch the ground, by tracing a path, a line, you add consciousness to the natural context of the mound, and the mound can transform into a double house of architecture. A double house in the direct sense that clearly you can see it's a double house, but also in the metaphorical sense that you don't know if the author was a natural author or Abraham himself. And then one example that is not really an architectural example, but a sculptor who I love, and also trained as an architect, and that might be one of the reasons why I'm so interested in him, Eduardo Chillida, the Poets' House, which I found just intriguing, that the Poets' House, same time, right, 1980, the other examples were all from the mid-1970s, the Poets' House is also a double house, a house of paradox, a house that is not based on synthetic form. Now, so that's Zeno of Elea and the idea of the double door, and you can't synthesize the double door in one perfect door, right, the synthetic door. Now, the second philosopher I want to point out in this context is Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard had a similar interest in structures of duality, and you can already see that just immediately in the fact that he published a double book called Either Or. It's two books that he couldn't write one book, he had to write two books. Now, what is the choices between either or in Kierkegaard? Either you decide to face the dread of decision-making, either you decide to decide, or you decide to never decide. And if you decide to never decide, you are part of the aesthetic paradigm, which means that you are constantly looking for what is beautiful form and copying other beautiful forms. When you start to engage the dread of deciding, then you enter the ethical stage of existence, or the religious stage in Kierkegaard, but let's bracket that out. You enter the ethical stage, and then you are really faced with the conundrum of having to make decisions in life. It's no longer just a matter of aesthetics, but it is also a matter of ethics. Now, I bring him up, in fact, because he wrote his PhD thesis on the concept of irony, and obviously irony is the topic of my book. And he wrote this book as a reaction to German idealism, Hegel mostly, and you know in Hegel that what you get, your kind of housewife knowledge of Hegel is that there's always thesis, antithesis, and they will eventually lead to a higher level synthesis. And time is kind of conceived as a spiraling thing where thesis and antithesis are always kind of sublimated into a higher stage of consciousness, which is the synthesis, that then attracts a new antithesis. But synthesis always plays a big role. For Kierkegaard, it's all, this idea that time would kind of create a higher stage of consciousness is all bull. Kierkegaard wants to undo this idea of the trilogy between thesis and antithesis that leads to synthesis, and just says, no, we never get to a stage of synthesis. The dialectics between one thing and its opposite always perpetuates, always keeps going. So that kind of paradox never goes away. And that's the core of human thinking, of what it means to think as a human, that you don't find closure, that you are never satisfied with a synthetic thought. But thinking just never finds closure. Now you could say, well, who in the history of architecture, who we know well, thought like a Hegelian? Well, isn't Gideon kind of a perfect case of somebody who, if you read the introduction to Space-Time and Architecture, says, well, architecture is in trouble because it has trouble bringing thinking and feeling together. And bringing thinking and feeling together, isn't that a synthetic effort? And all this talk about the talk about how architecture is progressive, how modernism is progressive, isn't that kind of part of the Hegelian logic of the spiraling temporality that makes the future always better than where we are currently, more self-conscious? Now, back to Kierkegaard. Here is one, in fact, for me, the most productive image that Kierkegaard found. It's an anonymous illustration. It's not really a work of art. It's just an image Kierkegaard found in the middle of the 19th century that he uses to describe the space of irony. How does irony work in terms of space? Now, for me, that was, of course, interesting. What is it? It's the grave of Napoleon, Why Napoleon? Because Napoleon is a strong authority in history with a clear afterlife after his physical life, meaning Napoleon is gone, but it feels like he's still alive. I mean, he has really a strong presence after his death, after he has already disappeared. So there is a subtle game about the absence of presence, or the presence of absence. He's gone, but he's there. And of course, this image shows exactly that. Napoleon, since it's his tomb, is supposedly buried underneath here. So the presence is not visible, but we know it's there. It's being referenced, it's being indexed by this stone, the gravestone. But then, of course, what happens in between these two trees, which is a vitalist trope, right? It appears in between trees. Kierkegaard says, 2 tall trees shade Napoleon's grave. There is nothing else to see in the work, and the unsophisticated observer sees nothing else. So it has to do with sophistication, with thinking, to see. Between the 2 trees, there is an empty space. As the eye follows the outline, the silhouette, suddenly Napoleon himself emerges from this nothing. So he emerges from the nothing, and now it is impossible to have him disappear again. So here, even more than with Zeno, this space is all about this paradoxical game between where something is and where something appears, where the physical presence is and where the form refers to that physical presence. It's an unresolvable dialectic as the generator of space. For me, this image and this Kierkegaard's explanation of this image is all you need to know about postmodern space. If you get that, you know what postmodernism is about. The connections to architecture of postmodernism are multiple. Now, let me just go to the showcase event of postmodern architecture. 1980, the presence of the past, Venice Biennale, you know the story well. Already the title, The Presence of the Past, sets this immediately in relationship with Kierkegaard's explanation of Napoleon's grave. There's something present here that is in fact absent. It has something to do with history, as you know. This is the Strada Novissima, the central space in the Arsenale in Venice. Every architect was asked to build a facade for an internal street, so this was part of this movement towards the street, the city. And Oswald Matthias Ungers, who is one of those more abstract protagonists of postmodernism, presented this facade, and you see that the parallels, I think, are quite obvious. Ungers called this facade "Ceci n'est pas une colonne." It's very, very much the same procedure as with Napoleon's grave. The facade hides the columns of the Arsenale. This is the same space without the facade, so the facades were hiding the columns. And now in Ungers' facade, the column appears as an empty space, as an inhabitable space in a place where the column is not. The column is hidden behind the facade, just like Napoleon was hidden behind the gravestone. And just as much as Napoleon was chosen for the reason that he is such an authority of history, the authority of history, of course, is here the main protagonist of classical architecture, the column. The column is just the authority that haunts the present with a paradigm of the past. And then Ungers called it, as I told you, "Ceci n'est pas une colonne," which is, of course, an allusion to Magritte's, one of Magritte's images, not the one that I'm showing, but Magritte plays with very similar tropes, spatial tropes of putting the figure in a place where it is actually not, meaning separating the presence and the meaning of a thing from the place where it appears as a kind of silhouette. Now, the influence of surrealism on postmodernism, I think, cannot be overestimated. Surrealism was possibly the most iconic embodiment of this thinking about paradox in the visual arts in the 20th century, and therefore we see the influence of postmodernism throughout surrealism throughout postmodernism. This is Unger's self-portrait, and you see that he inscribes his figure now into the empty figure, the empty silhouette of Magritte, Magritte's main visual icon. But you can also take other moments of postmodernism where surrealism was invoked for the very same reasons, I would say. If you just take, this is Kohlhaas's Facade at the same postmodernism biennale, where surrealism from, I would say, Yves Tanguy to Dali played a big role. And then, of course, in Delirious New York, where what does Kohlhaas do in Delirious New York? Basically, he says there are two paradigms of modernism, and we have only talked about one of them in architecture, the one that Le Corbusier, the rationalist, stands for. But what about the other paradigm, the other modernist? And that was Dali for him. And so it is the surrealist figure of Dali who made him see a city in Manhattan that might not be actually there, where everybody says Manhattan is the city of pragmatism. Kohlhaas said it's the city of poetry, where he says the congestion is normally perceived as a problem. Kohlhaas says, no, let's make the problem into an asset, a cultural asset, into a culture. So this paradoxical play between what is and what form can be made into is something that is also underlying Kohlhaas's thinking at that time. And this image is an image that I love, which is, of course, a Dali image that is being talked about in Delirious New York, and it's illustrated in Delirious New York. It is a redrawn image, a painting by Millet, redrawn by Dali. And so it's kind of the past is again haunting the present painter, Dali. But what is even more haunting here is that Millet had put the dead toddler of these two peasants in between them, and the two peasants were mourning the death of their kid, and Millet painted over the dead body of the kid because he thought it was too depressive. And so, but once we know that there was a dead kid lying in between these thinking people, now we know they are mourning, and in fact this empty space in between them takes on a figural meaning that never goes away, meaning meaning haunts our spaces. And of course, in postmodernism, spaces being haunted by certain meanings is everywhere, can be found everywhere in postmodernism. It has nothing to do with style, but has something to do with the way meaning and form is being set in relationship spatially. Other examples would, of course, be Rossi and De Chirico, although De Chirico is not a classical surrealist, but a metaphysical painter. But I think the ideas of emptiness and of the non-synchronicity of meaning and form is something that can be found here too. And I won't go into Rossi here, but the house as the empty carcass is very similar again to the idea of Napoleon, who is hidden under the tombstone, that the house is emptied out of meaning, and is just lying there waiting to acquire and get rid of certain meanings. Now, I want to just dwell a little bit on the idea that the past is haunting the present, and the notion of the strong authority in the past to be reckoned with. As this is, of course, an important trope for postmodernism, not only in architecture, but also in literary criticism, in philosophy. I give you one of the examples of literary criticism. 1973, Harold Bloom publishes the book The Anxiety of Influence. What is being said in this book is, of course, that every young poet, every new creator needs to make space for him or herself. Needs to make an original contribution to the field, doesn't want to be seen as derivative, And the anxiety that every poet has is, of course, that he might just be under the influence of a precedent, an antecedent who is upsettingly more alive than the young poet, him or herself. Meaning, if you do write poetry and you notice Shakespeare has already done this, you need to find, in a very narcissistic way, by positing your ego, narcissism plays a big role in this, that what you say is very different from what Shakespeare said. And in order to do that, you have to misread, to be able to misread Shakespeare, to ironically swerve from what Shakespeare said. You might know that Shakespeare said something slightly different, but in order to create space for your original contribution, you need to misread your precedent. In terms of architecture, what did this do? Take Stanley Tigerman. He drew many of these cartoon drawings. This one is the biggest one that he did, his career collage. And you see a universe, an architectural cosmos, with many of his buildings, but also, and I want to point out one of the buildings, this one, Mies van der Rohe's building in the center of Chicago. Tigerman is from Chicago. Obviously, it is a Miesian building with the addition that the very abstract buildings of Mies are made into symbols, crosses. Tigerman, at this point, knows that Mies is dead, but he also wants Mies to be dead in order for him, Tigerman, to swerve from his architecture, from his influence, and posit his own space, if you will. Here is another one of his collages that you have seen also a zillion times, the Titanic. The Titanic is Mies's Crown Hall at IIT, in a precarious position in Lake Michigan. Now, is it sinking? We will never know, and Tigerman insists that it is not really sinking, but it is floating. Certainly, the clarity of this pristine building is inserted into a geometry that is ever-changing, the water, the clouds, ever-changing, and these are the figures of psychoanalysis, the idea that water is semi-transparent, semi-opaque, that you kind of see what's going on underneath the surface, but you never know, is a kind of psychoanalytic trope that Mies is now immersed in, so that you can find something else in Mies. Mies is sinking, but or floating, but it is certainly immersed in a new psychoanalytic milieu where the young poet feels his anxiety of influence. Now, so Tigerman can neither simply reject the modern paradigm of Mies because he was made by that paradigm, he was formed under that paradigm, nor can he simply accept it because he would feel that he is just derivative of Mies. And that doubleness, that paradox between accepting and rejecting is what is expressed here. We have seen a very similar trope, spatial trope, active in Madelon Vriesendorp's Freud Unlimited from 1975. We would not conventionally bring these architects in relationship with one another, certainly not stylistically. I doubt that they would want to be seen as part of the same game. For me, they are. The very same motifs are at play here. We have again the water. We have the tower that is inclined at the exact same angle as the Titanic, the Mies Crown Hall. And again, the Empire State Building in Vriesendorp's painting is not simply sinking, but it touches the infrastructure of the city, meaning, again, the infrastructure being also the psychoanalytic infrastructure, as we know from Delirious New York. It is all about finding the unconscious of the pragmatic Manhattan, the delirious aspect of Manhattan. In order to find that, you have to lift the blanket, this thin layer of the superstructure which the Manhattan grid is, and look underneath. Look at what lies underneath. When the past haunts us with its second coming, the initial optimism and utopianism of that first model is broken. An idea that you see in Ettore Sozzas is another utopia. Already the title of this image is just, oh, another utopia, another one of those. It's going to eventually die, right? 1973, another utopia, where Archigram's Walking City, a very optimistic techno-utopia is wrecked, caught in a swamp somewhere between, well, if that isn't the tree of wisdom, of knowledge, of paradise, somewhere caught in between Arcadia or Utopia, Arcadia probably, and the realism and the pragmatism of Manhattan. That's where utopias get stuck, in between those poles that can never be brought together in synthetic form. The dialectic keeps going. Now, the wreckage of history can paradoxically be made into a project itself. That's kind of Manfredo Tafuri's paradox that he pointed out, that was so important to him and so problematic to him, that every negative project is eventually turned into a positive project. And the example that Manfredo Tafuri would always give is the example of Dada and surrealism. We have already seen how surrealism becomes, which is kind of a negative critique of our shallow mode of existing in the here and now rather than the fantasy land, is turned into a positive project. Big problem for Tafuri, but of course kind of the essence of postmodern space. Sight certainly did that, meaning the ruin, even the ruined building is turned into a positive project. Here, Sight again, and we saw at least one project today in the thesis that was dealing with the idea of the flipping of the vertical facade into the horizontal plan. And, well, here is Sight, how they did it. The water of the canal turns into a waterfall, a kind of surface of water, and the facade is flipped into the horizontal where it doesn't belong. Or the building is sinking in the canal, which is, of course, something that is actually happening catastrophically in Venice, but is here turned into a kind of architectural, positive, constructive project. This double-sidedness, this paradox, is, of course, something that postmodernism was always interested in. And then I just have to bring up Peter Eisenman's Venice Cannaregio project, which is, as you know, based on an absent project, a ghost, Le Corbusier's Venice Hospital that was never realized, a project from 1965 that, if anything, just survives as a ghost, so it's kind of haunting. The past is haunting Eisenman when he comes up with his series of interventions in the context, on the context of Venice Cannaregio, based on the module, the grid, the MET system of Le Corbusier's building, but interpreted in a kind of ironic swerve as misread. Everything is misread in this project. The MET building that is kind of sitting on top of hovering above the ground, is now turned into an excavation project that digs into the ground. You know, misreading. The extruded courtyards of Le Corbusier are turned into holes with shifted and rotated red pavilions. So the negative space is made into a positive space. The added volume of Corbusier's building is turned into a series of rotations and oscillations. So all these interventions are meant to, of course, swerve, meaning turn away from the past, from the authority of the past, which in this case is the ghost of Le Corbusier, just very similar to the ghost of Napoleon in Kierkegaard's ironic space. So there's the project, Eisenman's project, is a kind of series of liberal interpretations of the precedent. Now, this is an early sketch of the Cannaregio project that I found at the CCA in Montreal, and where I found this very meaningful, where Eisenman says, well, this project is about showing and then denying, meaning you have to posit something that you do, and then deny it, reject it. This double-sidedness, in fact, gives you nothing but paradox. Why would you show something if you want to just deny it? Well, of course, for those who know Derrida well, Derrida did something very similar, that he said, we always write under erasure, meaning we posit a notion that we have no idea about what it is, like being. How can we posit being if we are ourselves? I mean, do we posit ourselves? But we can talk about being if we also cross it out at the same time, where we say, well, we mean being, but you all understand that I don't really know what being is. So this writing under erasure for Eisenman, this showing in denial or in as rejection is a paradox of how postmodernism dealt with the haunting past. And you probably know that in Eisenman's case, his own past, his own kind of regio project would follow him to later projects of his that Jeff was also part of with Derrida. In this case, the ideas behind the garden in Trumi's Parc de la Villette, where the Cannaregio project, which was already a misreading of a previous project, was now misread in a new context, this time not in Venice, but in Paris, etc. So this idea that the past haunts us, and if we misread it successfully, it turns into an original contribution rather than being just derivative. And just to show you that other artists also played with very similar ideas, artists who, in fact, we do associate with postmodernism here, Hans Hollein, who said, well, you know, how do we think up, dream up new figures? Well, let's just see how we do it with fable figures. They are always composites of fragments from figures that we know from the past. We take a part of the fish, a part of the human, we recombine them, and they turn into a new, we misread the past in order to turn the past into new figures that are not simply derivative, but original contributions, where meaning and form are not synchronous, but are doing weird swerves, ironic swerves. The same Hans Hollein drew or mounted a portrait of one of his friends, another one of these postmodern architects, Arata Isozaki. And here you see that Isozaki is not, the portrait of Isozaki is not as a unified person, but is kind of an anatomical Frankenstein composed of different components from the past. The head is Marcel Duchamp, the ears Robert Venturi, the neck Philip Johnson, the genitals Kenzo Tange, the buttocks Marilyn Monroe, etc. So the portrait of the postmodern architect doesn't give you a unified synthetic person, but gives you a Frankenstein, a composite of fragments that come from different places. So that's the portrait of the architect. The architecture by the same architect does kind of something similar, where Boulet, Ledoux, Sterling, what have you, are all recomposed into a new context that is ruined, just like the body of Isozaki itself is shown as a ruin, as something that doesn't add up to a synthetic new form. We know that, again, since I talked about surrealism, we know this technique from surrealism, the idea of the exquisite corpse, where multiple authors draw a figure without knowing what the other author has drawn, and what you end up is a kind of funny or grotesque body that is an exquisite corpse, just like the portrait of the architect as conceptualized by Hollein, or Isozaki's own building. By the way, Isozaki entered the competition for this building with this drawing. I mean, you have to do that, show in a competition project your own building as a ruin, and he won it and he built it. Now, this idea that synthetic form is not possible, this slick, elegant, integrated form is not possible, but that every form turns into a composite, fragmentary, contradictory form, is the basis for a whole range of urban concepts about the heterogeneity of space. You know, here are just some of the ones that you know from these postmodern years, from the Captive Globe to Roma Interrotta, to Colin Rowe's image that he made a big deal out of in Collage City, to the Archipelago project, to the Parc de la Villette, etc., by Trumi. Now, I could, of course, keep going with all kinds of architectural examples. I'm getting close to the end so that you can relax. But what I meant to do with my book is to avoid and undo cliches about postmodernism, many of which have been produced also by Frederick Jameson himself. One of these cliches is that postmodern architecture is all about a certain style, a certain facile aesthetics that deals with quoting a pastiched version of the past, or that is based on stylistic eclecticism of anything goes. Now, that postmodernism is shallow and market-driven, I couldn't see that when I researched postmodern space. I think that the influence of existentialist views of existence on postmodernism show that it's kind of the opposite of shallow. I mean, how much more existentialist and deep and psychoanalytic can you get than what I've shown you? I wanted to include in this story people who didn't want to be seen as postmodernists. Eisenman, Abraham, as I told you. I mean, even Venturi doesn't want to be a postmodernist these days, which in my mind is totally absurd. I mean, when was that moment where postmodernism turned into such a bad guy? I mean, what's so bad about it? I mean, of course, we don't like many of the buildings, but then look at modernism. Not every building is really a work of art either. Postmodernism in architecture was very theory intense. There's a very rich discourse. It's very conceptually dense, which I find interesting because it really allows us to talk about architecture, to talk about architecture as a kind of cultural discipline. Form, the notion of form, not shape, not form, is used to articulate the incongruities that are perceived at the basis of existence. Mostly a very interesting process leads us to the articulation of complex form. Form is not smoothened into a synthesis, but the kind of incongruities of forms are always drawn attention to in postmodern architecture. I mean, just look at what Michael Graves does with the column. Here he scales up the capital to tell you, well, a capital is no longer a capital. Here is a column that is not made out of any support material that has the ability to support, but it's water, which does the opposite of supporting a building. It just falls. And it's made out of a material that flows. You know, think of Heraclitus. Everything flows, nothing abides, even classical architecture. I mean, there's a commentary on what has become of classical architecture. The capital has turned into glass, fragile. Classical architecture has turned fragile, and all of that. I mean, it's very rich as a discourse. Form is used as the articulation of cultural ideas, and that is what I find so interesting in postmodernism. Now, just to end with, I would say that today architecture has turned green. And I don't mean the conventional sense of having become aware of the natural context, although that's also the case. But what I'm showing you here is the brand new news broadcast studio of the German national TV, a studio that has been nicknamed the Green Hell by the press. It's, of course, a green screen, a space that is nothing but a green screen for digital image compositing. Turned second nature, right? It's like nature. You can immerse in a context that is endless. Ideally, there's no durable architectural feature that anchors this space in a specific time and place. No windows, also in the sense of, Windows, the software system. Old, when a physical window pops up, like in architecture in the old days. There's no more window here. All images can be overlaid so that new immersive context can be created. I'm using this example of a space to contrast the character of contemporary space with the one of postmodernism. Postmodernism was more self-aware than aware of the world. It wanted to draw attention to itself, wanted to turn opaque. Here I am, I'm not about anything else, but here I am. The Green Hell, on the other hand, insists on immersion, on where the illusion is foregrounded over disillusion. In postmodern space, it's about disillusion. What you see is not exactly what you get, But here it's all about the illusion. Everything is already subsumed under the logic of seamless continuity. For postmodernism, the passage of time was dramatic. History actually exists. In the green hell, there's an eternal present. Nothing sticks to the green surfaces of the green hell. You remove images, you project new images. When the news changes, you have a new immersive world to project. There's no referencing to anything. This space is always new, always of now. In postmodernism, architectural form demands attention in the Brechtian sense. Brecht's epic theater, which is based on the idea that illusion goes away. When you look at Brecht's theater, you never think that what you see is actually a representation of real life. He always breaks that illusion. In the green hell, no attention is needed. It always creates a sensual environment for enjoyment that is a perfect illusion. Now, I will conclude with this. For architects, it is important that we understand that we create spaces, and we should not think that we have to conceive of spaces the same way as a user of a building does, meaning to just enjoy them. We have to critically construct spaces, and we cannot play the user of the building, we have to be the architects. So we cannot imitate the affective naivete of the user of a building. A composer conceptualizes a musical score, doesn't sit there and says, oh, this sounds beautiful, let's make a song out of it, or a piece of music. The second point is that we have to resist the pragmatism of the design approach. I know that design is the thing to do, sells really well, but industrial design has no discipline. There's nothing to say about industrial design, really. Or about fashion design. They have just started to create a discourse, but it's just not as interesting as architectural discourse. Just watch Project Runway with Heidi Klum. It's just not as interesting. There is not the same discursive and disciplinary backing that architecture has. And we have to cultivate that. Architecture is a cultural discipline. It's not simply design. That's why it should be part of the humanities. That's where it belongs. That's why architecture is so rich, and architects have always done more than creating beautiful form. And therefore, a pragmatist approach to the built environment, in my mind, is bullshit. I hope that Princeton is not going to give in to that approach. When I see what pragmatism and pragmatist thinking does to architecture, restricting its influence on the world, I become almost nostalgic of the years of Colin Rowe, where you need to have some kind of conceptual continuity between the surface of the building and the deep space of the building. To just say that the deep space of the building is not the domain of architecture because it's the domain of investors is, for me, to give up what we can do as architects. And then one more thing, in the interdisciplinary discussions that have become the thing these days, we need to make sure that we are useful as architects as a member of the team, meaning that we know what our expertise and our discipline is and what our role is in an interdisciplinary discussion. And we should not constantly emulate the philosophers, the contractors, the engineers, everybody else except the architect. Therefore, the discipline of architecture is something that shouldn't be abandoned, because we would be abandoning what defines us most. Thank you.